It actually affects your brain similarly to bright light. People who regularly drink coffee seem to be protected against cardiovascular disease and even neurologic conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and MS. And when you bring it back, man, you see, what a potent drug coffee really is.
So what is the cost? Coffee seems like this kind of miracle drug because everybody can point to the upsides of having coffee in the morning, whatever, but nobody has been able to really articulate to me the cost. And all these things in life have a cost, right? We live in a society now where many people will have multiple cups of coffee before 12 o'clock, before midday. And nobody seems to be able to tell me what the cost of that is. But there must be one because nothing in life is free.
Yeah.
So what is the cost?
Well, everybody's different. So, people metabolize. Some people are slow caffeine metabolizers. Others are not. And so, you really have to like determine for yourself whether or not coffee is something that works well for your body. It is a type of stress. I will say that. So for people who are chronically stressed, adding coffee to the mix is probably, just adding fuel to that fire. And it's not that I want you to get rid of the coffee. I'd rather see you get to the root cause of where that stress is coming from. But it can stimulate cortisol release, and it is a powerful stimulant. We know that. It can also negatively impact sleep. It actually affects your brain similarly to bright light. So that's why, for many reasons, you want to make sure that you are consuming it, far, far away from bedtime. But it honestly is hard to find a downside to coffee. I mean, there really is there is good research on it. Recently, it was discovered that the caffeine in coffee acts like a natural PCSK9 inhibitor. So I know that's like an unfamiliar, it's like a mouthful, but there's a new class of, I think, relatively, benign cholesterol lowering drugs on the market called PCSK9 inhibitors. Now, I'm not anti-cholesterol or anything like this. Some of our most healthful foods actually act like natural PCSK9 inhibitors. Dietary fiber, in a way, is like a PCSK9 inhibitor. But they found that high dose caffeine actually, at about a dose of about 400 milligrams, can actually act like this drug where it makes your liver more effective at recycling cholesterol carrying lipoproteins like LDL. And so that kind of like adds a mechanism to the observation that we've seen that people who regularly drink coffee seem to be protected against cardiovascular disease and even neurologic conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and MS. So there seems to be this protective effect of coffee, but it's always important to caveat these findings with the fact that these are averages. So on average, coffee seems protective, but certainly within those cohorts that are being studied, some people are doing really poorly with coffee as well. So you just, it's something that you really have to like regularly take inventory and ask yourself, like, is this working, for me? I think one of the healthier ways to ingest coffee is to not consume it immediately after waking up, which, I'm guilty of doing many days, but like, it's generally something that's like, you're better off consuming like an hour or two after you wake up. And again, not too late into the afternoon, either. And like also, the dose I think is really important. People that develop caffeine dependency, they think that they're improving their performance with caffeine, but what they're really doing is they're treating their withdrawal from caffeine. So another way that I like to kind of make sure that I'm consuming it in the most mindful way possible is I'll take like occasional weeks off from caffeinated coffee and I'll switch to decaf. Yeah, and I feel like it sort of helps like resensitize my brain, breaks the dependency a little bit, and then I bring it back. And when you bring it back, man, you see what a drug, what a potent drug coffee really is, But in general, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of coffee. It's rich in polyphenols. It's a natural activator of our body's NRF2 pathway, which is like a detoxifying pathway in the body that's also stimulated by cruciferous vegetables.
Something, again, I've been thinking a lot about ever since I bought myself a Whoop, which tracks my sleep and gives me some data in the morning about how I slept, is how to improve my sleep via my diet. What advice would you give me there if I wanted to have deeper, more quality sleep? What should I be eating, not eating, avoiding, what times, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you want to not eat too close to bedtime. There's sort of like a Goldilocks zone where, I think we're meant as diurnal creatures, meaning creatures that typically eat during the day. You want to eat your last meal about 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep. You don't want to go to bed hungry. I mean, people obviously have different different preferences, and I think preference in many ways reigns supreme. But what we know from circadian biology is that we're meant to eat about 2 to 3 hours before we go to sleep, and you don't, like, that's to give space between your last meal and sleep, because sleep is a time for rebuilding and restoring. We see this like interesting hormonal shift in the body that is really like, it's why sleep is, we rejuvenate in many ways, like our bodies, our cells, our tissues when sleeping. Part of like how we get there is a change in body temperature. And, we see this like this dip in body temperature right before we go to sleep, or just after actually we go to sleep. If you eat a really like meat heavy meal right before you go to sleep, a lot of people notice that doing that can negatively impair sleep. And I think one of the proposed mechanisms why that happens is that we have the thermic effect of protein is quite high, particularly compared to fat and carbohydrates. And so you've got this like internal furnace like burning in your gut, like to try to break down and assimilate all of the precious amino acids that you've just ingested. And so I think that can sometimes be at odds with like that wind down process, that circadian, wind down process. So yeah, I would try not to eat too close to bedtime. Many people feel like eating carbs before bed does help them sleep for that same reason. Like maybe they have cortisol, still like, a bit of cortisol dysregulation, and carbs before bed seems to be able to help with that.
When do you eat? If not before bed, like, sometimes I've been guilty of eating while I'm falling asleep. This is old Steve, not new Steve. But when do you eat? You talked about intermittent fasting. I read some things that said you start eating roughly at like 11 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
What's the window in which you eat?
I generally will, I generally won't have my first like food until, these days it's about 10:30, 11 in the morning. I've been experimenting with carbohydrates before exercise. For a long time, I really enjoyed fasted workouts, and lately I've been experimenting to see what a little bit of peri-workout carbohydrate does for my lifts, because I love fitness, so I've been kind of experimenting a bit with that. But the general rule of thumb that I practice is that I don't eat for an hour to an hour and a half after I wake up. Part of the reason for that is, and again, just to like preference, personal preference is really like key here. So, a lot of the like recommendations that I'll make, like you might see a smidgen of benefit, but at the end of the day, like if you can't, work out at the optimal time, or, eat in the optimal windows, like, still what you eat and making sure that you are getting exercise is better than like not, because of like a fear that you're not doing it, optimally. Like exercise is crucially important. Eating a whole foods, animal inclusive, plant inclusive diet, I think optimal. But what circadian biology is showing us is that when you eat immediately after waking up, you might not have had your melatonin, for example, fully subside, which is a sleep hormone. When melatonin is elevated, as it starts to, rise once the sun begins to set, that sends the signal to our bodies essentially that the kitchen is closing, and that we're now approaching the time where we're going to change the guard. It's like a changing of the guard essentially, where we're going to focus on rejuvenation and repair. When people wake up in the morning, that hormone hasn't fully necessarily subsided yet. And that can have the consequence of making us not as insulin sensitive. So it might impair glucose regulation. while it's still elevated. And so like eating carbohydrates in that window, particularly like as they typically appear in the standard American diet, the bran muffin, the glass of orange juice, like that's, I don't think, like an appropriate breakfast for that time of day. I mean, you might be able to get by with something like that later on, but generally like after you wake up, you want your melatonin to fully subside, and also cortisol, which is your body's, we talked about that as a stress hormone. Cortisol is not bad. It's also your body's chief waking hormone. That's the highest that it's going to be throughout the day in the morning.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.